Hi. I make machines. Or at least I try to. I make, or at least try to make, distributed systems for the purpose of bypassing unjust hierarchies and empowering the oppressed. This is what I spend all my time thinking about. This is what I spend a lot of my time doing. This is where I draw my self-esteem. This is what I spent my time in college doing. This is what I've been trying to do since. Today, I am making a video to go through my dissertation, to go through the first machine that I made, the truth machine. It is a very imperfect work. I am not very good at reading out loud. This will probably be somewhat painful to get through for both me and the listener, and for your patience, I thank you. But I think it's important. And I think that in any kind of liberating movement, I think there is a need for people who have this kind of critical design practice. Introduction. How do one design a public sphere? Before one may design, one must specify a working definition of what a public sphere is. The notion is the one great thought of the German theorist Habermas, and was developed by him throughout his professional life. Here we will primarily be working with the notion as it was redeveloped in Volume 1 of Theory of Communicative Action, 1984, whilst maintaining fidelity to Volume 2, 1987, in a more implicit manner, peppering in occasional reference to the early dissertation, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, 1962, and subsequent later development of his lines/terms by other theorists. The working definition must be formulated in relation to the most dexterous, most powerful theoretical construction possible in order to render adequate scope for impactful design. Castell's grounded theory largely concerns such a construction, the network. Castell's works with an ontology of breaks and flows between nodes. What flows between nodes, the vertex, is conceived of him as the scape of the network, i.e. infoscape, information, finscape, money, etc. This is developed throughout his body of work, but here we will be drawing mainly from Communication Power, 2009. Such a formulation of Habermas' conception is given by Singh, 2023, in a rather more succinct language than the German is accustomed to use. A public sphere is a network for communicating information and points of view, situated in a society between the realm of the private sphere and the sphere of public authority, as a sphere mediating between them. To approximate a public sphere, the other side of the equation, now formulated in terms of the network, an exploratory narrative shall be built up through a complementary fusion of actor network theory and design fiction. More will be said of that methodology in a moment, when the subject's preamble is out of the way. Do we not already have a public sphere? Not in any strong, systemic sense. Habermas' initial formulation was also on account of its diminishing. Later criticism from historians, as referenced by Singh, have disputed his historical account as being inadequate. Flipping the question to the opposite pole, did we ever have a public sphere? In terms of overarching societal systems, there is something that occupies the structural position between the private sphere and the sphere of public authority, but it's not the public sphere, it's the media. Only at this far-out level of resolution could the media be fused with the public sphere. In terms of the specification of network relations, the media broadly are not described by the ideal of the public sphere at all. Rather, in specification, they are best described by the functionalist, empirically bulletproof propaganda model of Hermann and Chomsky, 1988. Particularly relevant for the study of network relationships is Hermann and Chomsky's focus on concentration of ownership as it relates to power over the flow of information. Note that concentrated ownership is a point of continuity that extends into contemporary developments, such as social media, vis-a-vis Fuchs. Habermas' conception requires relative power equality between nodes. Concentration in ownership is demonstrated by Hermann and Chomsky through their study of worthy and unworthy victims to produce media output that reflects almost always the interests of powerful nodes. This would indicate a severe disparity in power. In terms of network relationships, the media by and large demonstrate unidirectional connections in an infoscape, flowing from/through power centers to assorted structural positions. Subsequently, the task at hand is one of network relationship approximation and transfer, to build into a media infrastructure features and flows that will produce information transfer of a similar vein to what a robust public sphere would produce. More could be said to the extent to which the media fail as a public sphere, but why waste the ink? The general problem has already been broadly described, and the specifics change so fast that in attempting to capture them perfectly, this work would be rendered obsolete by the time of its publication. The author has no interest whatsoever in splitting hairs of historicity, factuality, or degree. Through radical design, the author intends to put forth a positive contribution that would A. hedge between theorists, therefore being explainable within a plurality of theoretical positions, and B. hold a genuinely viable germ for future germination. Now is not the moment of definition of the past. It is one of design and thereby contention in the shape of the future. It is in this light that the author offers this current attempt. Here will be laid out the digital infrastructure/architecture for an infoscape network for carrying critique. The notion of critique is fundamentally developed from Baudrillard's conception of seduction as the potential energy of reversibility, and as identification of the field of the imaginary as the site of plausible resistance. Design here allows yet another reversal of Baudrillard's method. Rather than critique as weapon, as demonstrated in Forget Foucault, 2007, as in mode and content and intensification of Foucauldianism into its death, this work is concerned inversely with weapon as critique, as that weapon is a network. Where Baudrillard shoots a rifle, this work builds a bomb. Note here that the implied sharp temporal shock of physical violence does not carry on to this plane of symbolic violence. Baudrillard's rifle supplants so much as it kills. For such a bomb to be built, critique, as detonator, needs to be emancipated from its subaltern position to mediums incorporated into capital. Capital's incorporation of the therein produced forms into content is inevitable. However, that will serve as the secondary charge, i.e. distribution. Such an emancipated form is suggested by Land and Murphy, 2019, and demanded in response to Land, 2018. Relevant here is the relationship of the blockchain to time. Afforded by the technology is a unified sequencing that would facilitate the application of protocols for the facilitation of a digital game. Furthermore, that blockchain itself offers the possibility of novel root-around procedures due to its historical isomorphism with a distributed network of redundant nodes designed to withstand nuclear attack is perfect. Land is operating with a definition of critique that is different yet eerily similar to the author's, yet his analysis is cutting. Towards the end of the conversation between Land and Murphy, Murphy posits one final unlikely possibility for the future, for those who still hold on to the left-wing tradition. The blockchain could be leveraged as a sort of communist patch to circumvent Land's apocalyptic vision. Land is of course skeptical, but in principle supportive of such a possibility. What we have in the blockchain is a way to program networks with potentially radically discontinuous logics that can root around traditional gatekeepers. It allows the possibility to design a network where the network's relationship to users is more critical to its functioning than its relationship to any pre-existing powerful stakeholders. In that line, at the level of the individual, this project must fundamentally offer them a convivial, Illich, 1973, tool for knowing the truth about wickedly complex postmodernity, as well as expressing correct information that is insoluble to flow along lines whose solvent is capital. Given all this, the domain can be summarized as follows. Is there the possibility of a truth machine? Defining a truth machine as a digital approximation of the required network relationships for Habermas's conception of a public sphere. The body of this work will detail the core structures of such a machine. The standard this work hopes to reach with this design is that set out by Petrosky, 1997. A new artifact will displace an existing one only if there is a clear advantage that the new holds over the old. The most direct and successful means for establishing an advantage is to point out, through supplanting design, the shortcomings and failures of existing technology, and show how the new device serves to remove objections to the old. This is a form of critique intensified by McLuhanism. The message of this work is a new medium itself, whose form itself is a critique of the current media ecosystem. The end goal of such a critique is to supplant, alter, and forget. Table of Contents. Section 1, Getting on the Network. Section 2, the Blockchain Platform. Section 3, the Project Argument Structure. Section 4, Dynamic Flow of the Project Argument Structure. Section 5, Node Construction. Section 6, Network Construction. Section 7, Output of the Machine. definitions in dissertation presentation. In terms of methodology and framework, this dissertation form is a work of critical social, Harvey 2022, design fiction, Jacobs et al. 2022, Auger J. 2013. Design fiction is best summed up by the quote from Sterling, as quoted in Colton et al. Design fiction is the deliberate use of diegetic prototypes to suspend disbelief about change. In this incarnation, suspending disbelief is not to divest the work of the sense of rigour espoused by academia, but instead to divest it of the rigor mortis common to work that only attempts to describe what has already happened. Both design fiction, RTD Conference 2019, and Ant, in Shakey 2017, employ scaling orders of magnitude/resolution. Design fiction is a narrative device for the purpose of creating diegetic prototypes, and Ant in a methodological ontology sense as the actant is a set of relations in agency relative to the magnitude/level of resolution which is being viewed. Their complementarity, however, goes deeper than just shared tools. They are mutually sharpening. Speaking of Levine, Birchke, page 10, states that Levine's computer system creates the network that it claims to describe. How could one possibly suspend disbelief more effectively than by building a model that is itself an actant in relation to the thing it describes? As per figure 1, the machine will be constructed in 7 steps, building up through levels of resolution that form into a form that can diegetically carry its core flow. Steps 1 and 2 are the most disconnected and likely hardest to follow. Step 1 sets up the flow by which actors become users, thereby inputting the dynamism into the network necessary for it to function. The proof of identity system, which underwrites the proof of stake protocol, is resolved. A low-resolution view of the machine that confronts this flow is described. Much of the content of the later steps are touched upon but not expanded. Step 2 is the section with the most mathematics, though it is quite brief. Here, the proof of stake protocol is linked with CRED, the key metric for the site, and the payout sequence is sketched for later contextualization. In step 3, the project argument structure is introduced. This is a UX object designed to capture argumentation, as Habermas instrumentalizes argumentation. Its primary functions are A, to render tacit premises explicit, and B, to render argumentation into a form that is both modular and precise. Step 4 reintroduces an environment of users into the project argument structure, building it up into a stochastic game that is designed to trend towards consensus. In step 5, nodes are developed and specified as the playing space for the game built up in step 4. The positive amplificatory protocols of users' values are specified. In step 6, the nodes specified in step 5 are built into a blockchain network. The bounds and mechanisms of user programming of the network are sketched. Step 7 dissolves the internal-external boundaries of the machine somewhat, making explicit the core flow of the machine within a society it contextualizes. Now with the overview out of the way, it's time to define terms. Truth, big T, is here contrasted with truth, little t. Truth is the output of the truth machine. It is defined by its lack, i.e. a quality of information that could pass through a public sphere network, but will be unlikely to pass through a propaganda model network. Little t is any plurality of binary truth-like concepts used in analytical philosophy, i.e. correspondence, consistency, deflationary, etc. In epistemic terms, the set of truth, big T, is a subset of truth, little t. The relationship between the two truths is bridged by a third operator, prescience. Truth, little t, serves the end of truth, big T, in a very useful instrumental way. The analytical definitions are either true, false, on or off, 1, 0, binary. Because of this, they can be instrumentalized in a negative fashion, the way a riddling machine jettisons poisonous juvenile whelks. Prescience then attempts to, as a dialectic pole relative to truth, approximate truth and suspend attention. Prescience subsequently is being instrumentalized as a positive amplificatory quantification of the values of different actors on the machine. Where C is a conclusion to an argument, C is approximately big T truth, where C is an element of the intersection between truth, little t, and prescience. Getting on the network. The blockchain network that supports the truth machine is a hybrid proof of identity and proof of stake model, where the proof of identity system is being employed as a sort of bootloader or unwriter for the proof of stake system. Though all content on the machine should be visible to non-users, all interactive functionality is foreclosed to those without an account. Figure 2 depicts the user flow through the process of account creation into the critical hermeneutic cycle. Porter Robinson, 2011. The truth machine is the contraption in its abstract theoretical form. Any realized instance of the machine is referred to as a national ledger, i.e. the Irish national ledger, the Palestine national ledger, American national ledger, etc. Actors that wish to become users on their national ledger must provide an IBAN or equivalent for a bank account they own, as well as their name as is on the account. From there, a disposable card is created for the purpose of sending a microtransaction to the account. Figure 2. If the money reaches the account, the name is verified, their user account is made, they are prompted to produce a password, the IBAN is hashed, and they may proceed on to the next step. Some form of verification is required in order to link a person to an account. The choice to use bank accounts is in contrast to other more intrusive forms of verification, such as biometric data, which are clearly unacceptable because they require sensitive data that would necessarily have to remain on the blockchain. Linking a name to a bank account through an IBAN or equivalent, on the other hand, is significantly less intrusive. Money can be taken out of the account using the IBAN alone, and the account ownership is relatively accessible, with some notable local deviations. As of 2021, 76% of adults globally have access to a financial institution. This is a significant uptick from 51% in 2011. It is quite likely that growth in access will continue as digital neobanks continue to reduce barriers for entry, which makes this form of verification the best choice when balancing accessibility and duty of care. During the initial self-identification, the now user must self-identify themselves using labels. The labels come in 3 categories: life world by institution, example, Dublin City University, Arklow County Wicklow, McDonald's, etc. 2. Life world by category, student, post-industrial shithole, precariat wage slave, etc. And 4. Identifications, example, black, Irish, surplus class, Mormon, etc. How users identify is really up to them. They are presented with a list of labels using the machine already, displayed with definitions, graphic and account of how many users use them. They may either choose these or write their own. When they identify with a label, aka an integral life world approximation, discussed below, they are saying, I am this, I am associated with this, I go here. Once this is done, users continue onto network code verification. This is the fulfillment of the proof of identity system and functions to furnish users with the metric called credibility. They will use it in the proof of stake system. Users must make public declarations of bonds with other users, giving some kind of trivial piece of information that they both would know, but which wouldn't have been made public. As well as this, users sign off on the labels of those they make bonds with, verifying that to the best of their knowledge, they are correct. Both users must co-bond or co-verify for a proportion of the starting cred metric to be given. The starting amount of cred is currently set for the proof of concept at 4 cred. The amount of bonds required to receive this is currently set rather arbitrarily at 10. The final step, education via community-built courses, refers to a functionality which extends the input funnel for the core flow, but is not itself central to it. Sparing a few words at this point, it can be said that Project Arguments may propose a syllabus to a community who may vote whether to commission or not to commission a course with an investment of credibility. Some courses will have to come pre-built on the machine to educate people how to use it. This is to break down the effect of what Castell's 2009 calls news indexing, which is a sub-mechanism of framing. Under the propaganda model, the news as such invents a placid public by its address in a one-way medium. To summon an active public, its constituent members cannot be addressed en masse, rather they must be given the affordance for information flows towards activation. Critical epistemology can not exist as a politics without facilitating pedagogical flows. At a low level of resolution, the motif that constitutes the radical break of the machine is familiar to anyone who has used the internet. Links, which appear on screen, directly summon the linked content, acting as pointers rather than the form of description and metaphor used to invoke in non-web structured texts. Such a structure may be leveraged to confront users with automatically updated complex information. This is, at a low level of resolution, the structural argument motif repeated at the various levels of magnitude of this work. For example, a word's definition is, by definition, how it is used. A term is used and understood in relation to how it is defined. Dictionary.com 2015. Such relationship manifests in the dictionary form as a self-stabilizing cycle of capture, where the cycle must pass through the value judgment and priorities of gatekeepers. Landau 2001. A link to an automatically updated page, however, may hold such circular relationships between word and usage open and in its rich abstract form, while circumventing the use of gatekeepers who can destructively edit. Once this motif is abstracted from the above example, the emancipatory potential of this move becomes clear. Reading signifiers through the ontologies and priorities of gatekeepers renders this signified only after negotiation with the gatekeeping systems, so much so that Baudrillard, 1985, can plausibly and provocatively claim that the maths' silence is their great divesting strategy. The link carries within it emancipatory affordances to usurp what is signified by signifiers, thereby affording the potential for a language and peoples whose meaning is defined not by, but in conscious negotiation to systems of power. Such a potential may seem to be confounded by the quotidian reality of social media. As per Fuchs again, creating the conditions for communicating truth is not the priority of social media companies. Selling targeted markets to advertisers is. As a practice in itself, it holds no value to these companies, because you necessarily cannot sell an audience for content that is uninterpreted, and the interpretation is carried out in accordance to monetary acquisition, not truth value. Attempts to create decentralized social media platforms have largely and uncritically reproduced the digital architectures born from these sets of priorities, and have therefore also overlooked the emancipatory potentials of digital space. Examples here, such as Diaspora 2019 and Mastodon, Roku 2017, amount to little more than decentralized Facebook or Twitter. It is the job of this paper to find and exploit the affordances of this space, to design within higher levels of resolution the digital architectural forms that would facilitate the communication of truth, big T. Cred basic, relationship to the block. Cred, or credibility, is a float variable used for the gambling/argument function of the truth machine. Once a user has gotten their cred from the network or co-verification, they will need to contend with the game to get any more. This is primarily done by betting some proportion of the C via creation of project arguments. The block verifiers are chosen based on the size of their stake versus the total amount of cred staked on the network. The stake of any given argument A1 is calculated as stake of A1 equals arg citations of A times B score of A. The details of the above function, B score of X, is given way below. Arg citations simply refers to the amount of citations the machine on the machine and an argument's conclusion has. Here, for the proof of concept, a chain of activity protocol, COA, is being employed. Nguyen et al. 2019. The follow the Satoshi FTS algorithm employed by this protocol is being used to index arguments in relation to their authors. The following is the probability that a user A is chosen to validate the next block, where the stake of A is the total stake for the argument of user A, and N is the number of staked users. The probability of A equals the stake of A over the sum of staked credibility on the network. To become validators, users must deposit their balance of cred. The reward for validating R is where R equals 2 times the cred investment of the paid out argument. which is withheld with the deposit until proper behavior can be established in relation to the relevant checkpoint block. In between this positive validation of the validator and the release of cred, the validator may be required to sit on a cred receiving jury to judge and escalate a dispute in which they have no stake. In which case a proportion of their deposit is staked on the judging argument they produce. Further details of the implementation of the open jury are given down below. At the termination of this cred receiving event, whether by validator validation or by producing a judging argument, the balance of the reward and deposit are released to the user. Note here that all argument stakes are paid out in relation to the ownership of the cred investment of the argument at time of payout. Refutations and interjections, actions which will be explained later in the text, as they challenge and take ownership of portions of this cred investment, summarily take an increased stake in line with their percentage ownership. The security of the system is predicated on the soundness of tying validator status to success in creating true/prescient project arguments. At the point of validation, the validator necessarily has an incentive to reproduce a system in which they have found success. Lawrence, 2017. Such a permanent distributed ledger is required for a would-be modern institution of radical critique, as to not facilitate a repeat of the decimation of the radical press in the 19th century, referenced in Herman and Chomsky, 1988, or speculative counterfactuals there since. Hancock, 2010. Genre. The project argument structure. Basic. Here we are working with Altman's 1984 semantic/syntactic conception of genre. The three following quotes are semantically/syntactically similar in the sense that they are quotes from written work that have been used to naively bolster the truth value of the surrounding text and associated worldview, syntax, by naturalizing them and their adherents as expressions of the worldview's conception of the highest virtues, semantic. The teaching of Marx is all-powerful because it is true. It is complete and harmonious, providing men with a consistent view of the universe, which cannot be reconciled with any superstition, any reaction, any defense of bourgeois oppression. Lenin, The Three Sources and Three Constituent Parts of Marxism, published 1997. But as for you, continue what you have learned and have become convinced of, because you know those from whom you have learned it, and how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. All Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. NIV, 2 Timothy 3, verse 14 to 17. The moral justification of capitalism does not lie in the altruist claim that it represents the best way to achieve the common good. It is true that capitalism does, if that catchphrase has any meaning, but is merely a secondary consequence. The moral justification of capitalism lies in the fact that it is the only system consistent with man's rational nature, that it protects man's survival qua man, and its ruling principle is justice. What is clear here is that this genre of communication instrumentally disrupts the emergence of any more prescient truth through pre-made definitional ad hominem. If one disagrees with Lenin, one is reactionary and bourgeois. Disagree with the Scriptures, then one is wicked and damned. Disagree with Rand, and one is unjust and non-rational. When viewing these worldviews as memes, Dawkins, 1989, this inbuilt logic of definitional exclusion makes sense, as it allows the meme that claims to describe the world to propagate in the minds of adherents without those adherents encountering other subjects in positive regard, who could report experiences that contradicted the logic of the meme and thereby induce cognitive dissonance, Cooper 2007, in the adherent. Inversely, the genre required of a truth machine is one that would channel the bolstering syntactic aim through syntax that was modular, precise, and did not allow power, as demonstrated in Luke's 1974, to ignore the effects of the application of its ideological programs. This proposed genre is the project argument structure. In a sense, this is aping Habermas's application of argumentation theory in his theory of communicative action. However, there are some key differences in emphasis and application. Habermas primarily employs the work of Tolman, where here whereas here the authors primarily being employed are Schwartz 1980 and Wagemans 2016-2019. Habermas did not have the theoretical use of any digital environment to apply his theory, whereas here the high control afforded by such an environment is instrumental. Through digital architecture, it is possible to prescribe users to formulate their syntactic truth claims within the semantics of premises, argument, conclusion. Though sometimes the argument is redundant, as the conclusions can follow from the premises. Here, to be valid, one must formulate their deductive, inductive, or conductive, Fairclough and Fairclough, 2012, argument within a prescriptive syntax that requires all tacit premises of the argument be made explicit, so that the argument is deductively valid. This is to use Schwartz's method for reconstructing arguments at the constructive stage of the argument, reducing redundancy and interpretive labour by shifting much of the burden off the interlocutors and onto the person making the argument. Fig. 5. Note, arguments being deductively valid have nothing to do with their truth value in most applications. Here it is merely being employed to prescriptively make tacit premises explicit. Where the project and project argument structure comes from is the modularity of the structure generated this way. The premises of any given argument can become the conclusion of another, working downwards until one is argumentology, metaphysics, or some other fundamental prerequisite. The same is true in reverse. The conclusion to the above argument can become the premise for another, building upwards, likely into ever more applied arguments. Premises for one argument can become the premise for another, reducing redundancy of work for those writing about the same subject on a similar epistemic plane. Conclusions may also be shared between arguments, giving greater argumentative resilience to a particular concept. What a project argument is, then, in relation to its constituent parts, has the same relationship as a gene to other genes and their composite nucleotides. A project argument may consist of any positive number of other project argument structures. Therefore, the state cost is fixed in relation to a publishing instance, not any fixed length of a project argument. Within an inductive, conductive / deductive argument itself, the relationship between the premise and conclusion can be represented graphically using Schwartz's intuitive deployment of Venn diagrams that depict the class relations of the relevant fulcrum lever predicates. A prerequisite for a common application of Schwartz's method between people, and Wagemans as well for that matter, expanded below, is that all theoretical terms must have a common referent within a given project argument structure. To make this work, any particular use of a theoretical term ought to be specified as to the 1. Exact way it is meant, and or 2. Lineage of literature is drawn from. What is required is a specification akin to a bastardization of Frege's 1975 conception of the sense of a signifier that can be accomplished by prescriptively mandating an explicit marker of what sense a theoretical term is used. Basically something akin to a citation, but inclusive of adjectives. If a user were to type the word ideological, it would prompt them to choose from existing senses that the word has been used. Example, ideological Zizek's 1989 sense, ideological pejorative sense, ideological Althusser's strong sense, ideological Chipper's weak sense, etc. If none of these suited, users could then type in their own novel sense of use. Before continuing with argument classification, it is worth expanding on the above manipulation of language. Words are being specified with greater precision than would be wieldy in normal phonetic language. This is the same fundamental structure as Wikipedia's disambiguation pages. For the project argument structure to be capable of representing as much valuable thought as possible, the capacity of language to form new words in this way will have to be employed vigorously. Grammar and game. Project argument structure advanced. Outside of the argument itself, Wagemans' 2016 periodic table of arguments is being employed for the purposes of classification. What Wagemans' method does, unlike other methods, is apply a consistent ordering principle to the classification of arguments, as opposed to constructing large diagnostic lists of fallacies, argumentation schemes, or schemic subtypes. All project arguments are classified according to their classification within Wagemans, according to the 3 federal classifications of characteristics, namely 1. First order, second order, 2. Subject-predicate, fulcrum-lever relationships, and 3. Typology of predicates. By class of meaning, i.e. statement of policy, statement of value judgment, or statement of factuality. To represent distinction 1 between first and second order arguments, the project argument structure requires another item of syntactic grammar. In this case, we're using parentheses, which here denote that the relationship to the conclusion is second order, i.e. external. Pinching Wageman's example here, this could be used in the case of an argument from authority, irrespective of the validity of the authority. It is an external argument and does not in principle does not interact with the status of the truth of the signified within an argument as it relates to the properties of the domain of the signifier. All the examples of second order arguments given by Wagemans can be represented this way. Example: argument from emotion, argument from character, and most importantly for rule enforcement, a topic force below, argument from tradition. What should, however, be stressed at this point is that Wageman's periodic table of arguments is being chosen not because it is a perfect categorical mapping. Wagemans himself described it as a work in progress. It's been chosen because its classification is enough of a natural kind as to provide sufficient meaningful specification as to chart a plurality of argument moves, which, when combined with common premises, give to a grouping using the structure any number of possible subgenres to experiment with. In short, it's the necessary rigidity for flexibility. The introduction of the parentheses notation also makes possible an explanation of the relationship between a source and a premise, Fig. 9. Though we must introduce the idea of a tradition and its associated standard of proof, a tradition is a consistent rule set formed from project arguments that provides the interpretive rules / conventions / acceptable methodologies for adherence to that tradition, i.e. do they accept all testimony? Do they have standards of corroboration that testimony must pass to be acceptable? Or do they only avow testimony's truth value in the statistical aggregate, etc.? When making an argument, a user is making a truth claim that what they are saying has truth value outside of their subjective experience. But that claim is necessarily being argued within a tradition and may be criticized for failing to be either true and or consistent with their purported tradition. A whole text could potentially be uploaded as a premise. Evaluations, which are external, interpret the work and its ideas / data and its value in line with a particular tradition. Here there is also the grammatical affordance for more hermeneutic readings, where one source is read through the other. Then the information generated in this way can be fed into the structure. The third distinction, wherein predicates are distinguished by whether they are statements of policy, judgment, or factuality, predominantly pertain to the classification of the conclusion, i.e. what is the nature and thrust of the work. This is covered in the next section and so does not bear further discussion here. The options a user has in terms of critiquing a project argument are 1. Internal interjection, 2. Internal refutation, 3. External interjection, and 4. External refutation. Typical structural examples of these forms of criticism are shown in the diagram below. 1. Internal interjection. This is the simplest of the 4 options. It is just to provide an extra antagonistic premise that develops the initial argument. All premises are interpreted within the same tradition and a similar interpretation of that tradition. Presuming success in response, the conclusion of the initial argument must be qualified in line with the interjected premise. 2. Internal refutation. This is to interpret the existing argument within a new argument, both predicated on the same tradition, though not necessarily the same interpretation. This might be used to add a premise that refutes the existing argument under the common tradition's conception of what that means, or argue that the initial argument is not adhering to the rules / conventions of the tradition in a non-trivial way. Incomplete arguments with missing premises are the most simple example of what this could be used for. Presuming success, the effect of this is to alter the initial conclusion in totality. 3. External interjection. This is to extend the initial argument outside of the rules of the originating tradition. Most of the time this is an unnecessary option, as one could just cite the initial argument and develop it within their tradition. However, it might prove useful in terms of critiquing value or policy conclusions where the tradition of the argument is inclusive of a value judgment. Presuming success, in response, the conclusion of the initial argument must be qualified in line with the interjected premise. 4. External refutation. This is for use when an argument is, for all intents and purposes, consistent within its tradition. However, there is a feature within the tradition itself that renders it unacceptable. Presuming success, the effect of this is to alter the initial conclusion in totality. The project argument structure splits/links a conclusion with its underlying reasoning, premises, and working assumptions. The bolstering syntactical aim in relation to protecting a conclusion from the above structure of criticism is channeled through a structure with the affordances to generate arguments that are inhumanly precise and explicit as to withstand intensified swarming critique. If the structure functions as intended, then it should be immune to phenomena such as informational cascade and herd behaviour, as defined by Slean and Kerov, because the information others know that supports their position is necessarily made available. In summary of this section, the project argument structure can be thought of as a platonically fractal scaffolding for channeling truth claims. Its benefit is that it liberates claims from their seductive prose and necessitates a form for them that is very precise. This is the precision that facilitates the gambling function of the machine. Viewing the truth machine as a UX object within the terms of social media studies, the project argument structure can be read within Bossonetta's 2018 third category of functionality, broadcast feed. Rather than ordering content in a feed based on algorithmic recommendation, the project argument structure, starting from a topic of interest, directs attention along a line of consistent argumentation. In the terms of Baudrillard, it is the map that precedes the territory. Instead of adhedonically scrolling downwards, one is forever travelling towards the bounds of what has been understood, codified, and made common. Dynamic flow of the project argument structure. All previous construction of this work rely on the validity of a structural congruence between non-deterministic stochastic games such as Texas Hold'em poker and Habermas's ontology of communicative rationality, 1984. That there are subjective actors who exist in a subjective field, but who share in common an intersubjective world. These actors can be said to be rational so far as they can orient their actions to intersubjectively recognize validity claims. This is much like Hold'em, where players have hole cards, which function as privately furnished information that the players hermeneutically read the common cards through, subjective field, and can be said to be rational insofar as they orientate their actions in line with the expected returns of their hand versus the real pot odds, measured relative to the other players, figure 11. However, even granting this congruence, there is an issue. All variants of poker rely on showdown to conclude a hand. During the showdown, the relationships of value between the made hands are known and the pot distributed accordingly. It is a trivial exercise to show, with backwards induction, Spaniel 2011, that without this revelation at the end of the game, all other decisions become meaningless. The truth machine requires the effect of this revolution, but necessarily cannot produce it in the same way. What it can produce, however, is in essence an anxiety game, a complete space of public work where every single decision made about a project argument is published on another project argument, and therefore subject to the acidifying force of rhizomatic critique and reversal. Decisions must pass through many hands, with the power to punish those who came before, if they were later proved wrong. For such a space to ever find equilibrium, once it has reached a significant scale, would require Habermas' conception of the unconstrained, unifying, consensus-breaking force of argumentative speech to hold. As a way to find and communicate information about the intersubjective world, such a game is desirable at various levels of magnitude. At the level of the synapse. Within cognitive science, the theory of affective intelligence is laid out in Castell's 2009, states that emotion is not simply separate or disruptive to cognition. Rather, it is complementary, acting as a semantic marker of the significance of information. Anxiety in the political context reduces a person's reliance on disposition and increases their reliance on contemporary information. McEwen is quoted in Castell's 2009. It is the optimal emotion to produce project arguments within. When describing the world, one can never know for absolute certain that one is correct. To make this impossible, demand of the users is to institutionalize anxiety systemically, in a manner not dependent on the subject matter of any particular project argument, at the level of the individual. This level of resolution is the most involved because it is the plane of design, hence figure 12. The payoff tree depicts the sequence of escalation in a case of a dispute. The payoffs are calculated relative to the credit investment of an argument being refuted on the national ledger. All other kinds of dispute, i.e. a different node than the national/interjection, followed the same overall structure and had their payoffs calculated in ratio to the differing credit investment. Therefore, if the shown payoff tree is valid from a game theoretical point of view, then the game in all its variations is sound. First, an argument is made on the national ledger, staking 1 credibility. The argument is challenged by the challenger, also staking 1 credibility. The original protagonist can either accept this and lose their credibility, or they can escalate, meaning they have to pay another one. From here, the challenger can either back down, in which case they lose their credibility, or they can call the escalation, whereby both of them have now invested 2 credibility each. This then goes to an open jury. The open jury then gets paid off by some of the credit investment that has been made into the arguments, and they can either rule for the protagonist, they can rule for the challenger, or they can delegate to a specialist life world on the machine. And the relative payouts of credibility are then displayed on the graph. The first 4 movements follow the fabrication of the initial argument by the protagonist and attempted refutation by the challenger. What's important to say here is that at every intersection, to continue escalating the conflict, a further argument has to be made in the sequence. Escalation sequence argument. The losing party is always better off if it does not escalate to an open jury, as part of their credit investment will have to be paid to the jury members for adjudicating the dispute. Therefore, they are incentivized to not escalate an argument if they have no feasible answer to the critique generated within the sequence. What has been left off the tree is the potential payout from the stake of the argument being fought over. That is because the value of such payout is highly contingent, not just on the features of the particular argument, but also the field of other staked arguments, what can be said, however, is that the only arguments worth facing an open jury for are those the author believes are both true and prescient enough to merit the author gambling and thereby potentially jeopardizing their ability to communicate in this space. 2. An open jury is comprised of volunteers. In the national group, it can be anyone. In a local dispute, preference is given to those who are members of the node that the dispute takes place in. In composite, the jury must equally contribute a credibility stake to match the total investment of both the protagonist and the antagonist, but are not disclosed what jury they will sit on until after the credit staked. The open jury must produce an argument to the effect of supporting the protagonist/antagonist or declaring a lack of competency to judge, and delegating to a particular specialist node, such as deferring to a node of doctors in the case of medical arguments. In cases where the party that was ruled against by the open jury challenges the outcome, the cred receiving jury, as was introduced in the cred section, are then tasked with judging the outcome. In this case, they are not just judging against the protagonist/antagonist, but also judging the judgment of the open jury, and can punish them for mistakes that they have made by ruling against them, which is in their interest if the open jury have put forth an argument that the cred receiving jury think will not hold with a general peer. If the cred receiving jury wish to keep the cred they have received through judgment, then the argument they produce in judgment had better be one they are willing to defend. The value of structuring the game tree as above is that it incentivizes users not to overburden the network with overdue judgments. That being said, there could be delays at any stage of escalation. The process can be started again by one of the involved parties. In dispute of one of the escalation sequence arguments made by the other side. That dispute must resolve before the initial one can continue, and so on. The scarcity of cred means that this cannot be dragged on forever. If one introduced a time limit on how slowly a decision or judgment may take, then one could calculate the maximum time limit a dispute instance may take to be resolved. If one knew the cred balances of both parties and the cred stakes of the argument being disputed. Once this is resolved, it may begin again. If someone else challenges the argument, previous judgment is not binding as precedent. Arguments that can survive such a space are those that define and qualify clearly. The project argument structure gives the affordance to be pedantically explicit and specific in its format, but also incentivizes conclusions being properly qualified in terms of probability, in the sense of Lovinger, but dealt with below. At the level of the network, Baltag et al. 2018 puts forth an epistemic model that boasts great explanatory power in generating observed phenomena of group knowledge. They build the model between two bounding knowledge states of a network. At the lower end is common knowledge, or everything known in common within a network, like the rules of the road among drivers. At the upper end is the epistemic potential of a network, which they define as the knowledge that members of a group may come to jointly possess and thus act upon as a group in a coordinated way by selectively learning from each other all the available information that is relevant to their own issues. Mediating between these states is epistemic interest, i.e. the question that a member of the network asks of a group's distributed knowledge, which frames the limits of the knowledge that they can gain from the exchange. If communicating through the project argument structure is valuable, then the cred metric is also valuable. If so, then prescribing that users must judge disputes between project arguments in order to gain cred artificially and systemically generates epistemic interest, as learning, understanding and communicating a position in someone else's dispute becomes a means to one's own particular end. Habermas, 1968, conception of the relationship between interest and knowledge is reproduced in this epistemic model, and is at least partially vindicated as prerequisite by Baltag et al.'s rigorous account of quotidian communication phenomena. The link is critical for the functioning of an institutional imposition of what Habermas, 1986, pinching from Kant, calls pure interest onto users. If one grants a public sphere is within the category of the good, to determine the concrete referent of the public sphere is to play a game which necessitates the maintenance and expansion of the public sphere, and therefore to serve pure interest regardless of motivating impulse. Without this mechanism, the whole machine would not work, because the machine necessarily relies on a plurality of agendas and interests, which by Baltag et al.'s model would likely produce a network with a weak epistemic potential, as everyone would only learn in relation to their own starting viewpoint. By the same mechanism that facilitates plural input into the recursive game, the recursive critical hermeneutic cycle itself is the output of the machine. Thus far has been developed a syllogism machine. Subsequently, the author must produce a complementary tension to pull meaning through these syllogisms. Otherwise, all we could expect here are useless certain descriptions. Put as a question, how should the structure of the UX be developed as to link to the structure of society, and thereby realize here the design ideal of truth, big T. Plumbing and identity nodes, the network basic. As per Habermas, 1984, both a realist and phenomenological conception of rationality presuppose those others who observe the same life world. That what is observed in the world relates to the structural position of the observer is a basic tenet of sociology as well as intersectional critical literature. Though here the author makes a point not to commit to any particular scheme of ordering stratification, given this, it is necessary to construct on the machine communities around the principle of a similar structural platform for observation without prescriptively specifying as much as possible what these platforms should be defined as. In terms of groupings forming online, Calhoun 1998 identifies the categorical identity as the structural trend emerging from the internet for grouping people in discourse based on a common interest. Calhoun identifies the historical role of the city as a fluid network linking via common situation, which, by his account, Habermas would agree, is more desirable for discourse, given that the truth machine, which must exist as an online forum, must also emulate to some extent the fluid situational dynamics of these long-departed metropolises. The groundwork for the solution was laid in the initial self-identification paragraph of the Getting on the Network flow. That is, users must provide an approximation of their identifications in life worlds via imperfectly integral categorical identities. These categories are then the nodes, and the users the connections through which project arguments flow. Node from here out will refer to a digital space where project arguments are displayed and ordered. See figure 13 and 14. With the right construction on top of the networks formed this way, the information plumbing of the truth machine can be built. B-score has already been touched upon, but can now be elaborated. Within any node, users may give affirming or dissenting subjective accounts to any argument. These should cost a nominal amount of cred, i.e. 0.05 cred. If it is a factuality argument, then its subjective account will generally consist of a personal account of a phenomena described in the argument. If it's a policy argument, then it's generally an account of a shareholder in the outcome of that policy. If judgment, then it's generally a personal account relating to the effect affect of a value judgment. This is not to be prescriptive, we're just defining most likely use case. An affirming account increments the affirming score variable by that user by +1 to all of that user's integral life world nodes. A dissenting account increments the dissenting score variable of that argument by -1 on all that user's integral life world nodes. The B-score for an argument in a node is calculated by B-score equals affirming score minus dissenting score times cred investment of argument. In plumbing information, B-score has two uses. First, an argument exists within a node only when its B-score is greater than 0, which means that in order to show up in a node, the affirming score has to be greater than the dissenting score. When a user commits to either an affirming or dissenting subjective account, this increments the affirming score variable on all the nodes they are part of. Within a node, the sequential order of visibility of an argument is also calculated by B-score, ordering from highest B-score, most visible, to lowest B-score, least visible. At the level of the network formed this way emerged publics in the sense of Warner in 1958, where a public is that which emerges by its address and citation. The benefit of the network we have constructed so far, as regard publics, is that they have no pre-specified network boundary and form in relation to the contents of a particular project argument as it relates to people's interests and solidarities. The interests and solidarities of associated structural positions subsequently become visible because it can be externally viewed to which publics they belong and to what degree. Structural positions of power are subsequently caught in a catch-22. If an argument does not propagate on certain nodes, it is clear that the structural position that the node represents does not share a common interest or solidarity. To affirm an argument that goes against the powerful node's interest is to amplify the conclusion closer to being a common visible fact. Power can't in this space, as Luke's 1974 demonstrates it is apt to do elsewhere, affirm without commitment. This is the implementation of prescience. For a user to give a positive subjective to an argument is to amplify its message in terms of visibility/circulation to that user's available nodes. The relative position of arguments in these nodes then becomes a negotiation of the interests held by members of the grouping of nodes. This is a sort of market stratification of the existing practice of collectivism, prominent on the left near 2018, giving greater buying power to the practice because it, unlike making project arguments, does not reproduce credibility. Optimal use of this feature would involve creating an affirming subjective account for the strongest available argument that concluded an interest or solidarity of the user. On the flip side, optimal use of the dissenting score would be to slow the spread of a message users felt should not flow through the network space they occupy. This then leads to the national grouping itself, straightforwardly a special node connected to the universal set of all users. If the cost of publishing a prejudiced argument to the life world groupings is 0.25c, then the relative cost of publishing in the national grouping should be somewhere around 1c, 1-to-4 ratio. As per the relationship between argument stake, cred investment, and B-score, an argument has a much higher chance of paying out if it is elevated into the national group, because of its increased investment and visibility to receive citations affirming subjectives. This should be the ultimate goal of any project argument, as its long-term prescience is here tantamount to its conclusion being fact. The nodes, networks, and groupings of this system have the potential to demonstrate complex and shifting relationships of structural positions and identity. There is continuity with Hall 1996, as this structure looks to the tactician's eye, hospitable to a form of radical politics where nothing is predetermined and the categories of representation melt and solidify in relation to evolving struggles. Rules, project nodes, and traditions. The network advanced. Bruns 2003 develops the paradigm of gatekeeping information in legacy news media into the gatewatching of the contemporary digital realm. Gatewatching concerns publishing and republishing of information in a less vertical digital space. This is very much descriptive of the B-score system that has been developed so far, as users have the ability to pull, order, and suppress information in line with their own interests and solidarities. However, the network we have been describing is designed to disrupt certain problematic aspects of this new paradigm. Chief among these is the tendencies for mythic constructions of the world through selective publishing of only information that supports pre-specified grand narrative. The project argument structure and integral approximations of life worlds do this somewhat. However, it is not enough to define the role of user gatewatchers negatively. For users to be able to systemically investigate the information that passes through their nodes, they require some legislative power over those nodes. Beyond that, presuming this structure is able to consistently generate rational decisions, then some reprogramming power over the system ought to be devolved to the network. Hence, we come to the necessity of rules. A rule is a special kind of policy argument that prescribes a convention or practice on the network. Like any argument on the network, it can be challenged, and it is binding on a node when it has a positive B-score. Currently, there are 4 theorized forms that users may make/apply rules through. The simplest is mandatory field rule, CFIG 15. The rule specifies some sort of mandatory fields the author must add to their argument to exist on the legislated node. This could be to the effect of a statement of any conflict of interest posed by the argument, or a statement saying that the argument is not plagiarized, etc. Enforcement of rules follows the same course as any other challenge to an argument. A wageman's rule, CFIG 16, legislates an acceptable or unacceptable argument formulation within Wageman's typology. For example, this could specify that an argument from beauty was invalid because a conception being elegant or pleasing did not relate to its being true. This may not relate simply to validity or invalidity. It could relate to specifications or conventions as to how specific argument moves may be made. The third example is scalping, CFIG 17. This is a form of rule that may only be applied on the national ledger. For its application, there must be made an argument giving sufficient evidence the user has broken a necessary rule for the maintenance of the public sphere. Example, they have made an account under a false name, or they verified someone else's to make multiple accounts, etc. In which case, the non-refuted prescience of a scalping argument on the national ledger renders the scalped account unable to stake cred. The fourth form of rule application that will be likely necessary for a viable machine is an API rule, CFIG 18. Like scalping, this is exclusive to the national node. An application protocol interface, or API, is a way for 2 or more computer programs to interface with one another. In this case, for project arguments to reprogram pre-specified variables on the network, e.g. the frequency of block creation, amount of bonds required to receive the starting amount of cred, etc. The particular set of possible interfaces would have to be specified in advance, balancing self-correction with the within the network with security vulnerabilities. It shouldn't be made possible to create an API rule that would stop or significantly hinder its own refutation. Now that rules have been touched on, the final addition to the network specification may be made. Whilst the above plumbing is necessary for the circulation of information, it is not necessarily ideal for argument fabrication. Just because someone also self-identifies a certain aspect or institution does not mean they will be good collaborators. Categorical identities in the strict sense have been discarded, but here must be reintroduced in a form carefully tailored to sit on top of the existing network. Therefore, users should be able to create project nodes. This framing here is to systemically link categorical identity groups with a goal. The name of the node is the aim of the project, instead of a particular stance or characteristics of the people pursuing that goal, thereby giving some distance in framing. Projects are identified by Castells as the unit of empowered work in the networked society. If users wish to make a project, they must stake 0.5 cred. This credibility investment is consumed when that user creates argument premises for that grouping. The user must formulate any rules at project group creation at no cost. Of these, they may choose which ones are non-negotiable and which ones are subject to change in the group. The cred stakes of the node are also set by the originator via a project argument. Others may join a project by building an argument or premise there. Even if a user does not join the project, if they see something valuable within it, they may give one of the accounts on the node an affirming subjective account as to boost its circulation. Likely the account will consist of their reason to do so. Project nodes, like the national node, require direct publication. An affirming subjective can only republish from this node not published to. Traditions are a special case of project nodes and that have been touched upon. All arguments must cite a tradition. The tradition consists of a general set of conventions, rules, and standards of proof that an argument its case with, and agrees to take criticism within. This is very much a reflection of current scientific and legal traditions as they operate within standards of proof relative to the phenomena that they are making decisions about. Lovinger, 2024. Lovinger points out that standards of proof evolve in relation to an institution and institutional development. Such evolution would surely be aided in an experimental environment that was more modular, mutable, and horizontal than the established brick and mortar institutions. Requiring a tradition of proof is to generate classes of information so that the probability value of that information was discernible at a glance. How sure, how certain, how accurate are features of information directly in correlation with the methods, assumptions, and framework it was generated within. Conclusion. At this point, description and specification must conclude. Though this work is necessarily unfinished, there are degrees of specification the author was not able to include within this brief sketch. No doubt, even between the author's full rich conception and a full viable machine, there is still a substantial gap. Yeah. What has been attempted here has been a sketch of an entire speculative ecology of information. No doubt this sketch bears the same relationship to any living truth machine as an introductory biology textbook has the complex networks of biochemistry that comprise any garden. Still, there is enough here to specify the core flow, which is really many flows, operating at different levels of magnitude, that constitute re-territorializing critiques of current information power apparatuses. Foucault, 1920, Deleuze, 1992. Presuming that the author's argument, such description, naive and incomplete as it must be, has inspired the reader's diegesis, then it is possible in this conclusion, through situating the narrative voice along these flows, to constitute an open-ended telos of the machine as a whole. Through this, the author aims to develop what diegesis they have earned with the reader into hope. Snyder, 2002. As a prerequisite to a truth machine, there must first be a hope machine. At a level of resolution close enough to be within the machine, but far out enough that no individual intention is in principle visible. The abstract relationship between the project argument structure and B-score system bear resemblance to a biological metaphor. At this level of resolution, the project argument structure is comparable to the structure of a dandelion, and the B-score or system, the wind distribution of seeds. Success in propagating then is dependent on the resilience of the propagated phenotype in the environment, translated through the metaphor as truth, little t, and the faculty of the seed to find fresh pasture, translated through the metaphor as prescience. Wind in this metaphor is the intention of individuals in the aggregate. This serves adequately as its shape at this level is both continuous and amorphous. The output from such a suspended tension of reproductive incentives is truth, big T, though to quantify this, it is necessary to move downwards and then upwards in terms of magnitudes. At the level of the individual in the information network, truth, big T, is a quality of information produced by the network formation itself. It is the product of translation between the subjective and intersubjective, the critical hermeneutic throughput thereof. It is meaningful to speak of a universal subject here because all subjects we are speaking of are subjected to each other through the apparatus of the machine, as that apparatus is designed to capture and facilitate communicative rationality. At the level of the machine within society, the significance of truth, big T, is easier to see if one formulates it in terms of what it signifies. Truth, big T, equals trustworthy information. Globally, both government and the media are institutions that have seen sustained and unchecked declines in trust. Edelman, 2023. This decline comes into even sharper relief when one segments levels of trust by income, in which case those in the bottom 25% of wealth, trust is the overwhelming majority sentiment. At the same time, the existential fears of those surveyed by Edelman are related to the actions and inactions of hierarchical institutions. Those fears, namely climate change, nuclear war, food shortages, energy shortages, are not aberrations, they are both sober and well-grounded. Whilst there is a global vacuum in trust, it remains absolutely essential for the perpetuation of the social order. Mulligan, as discussed in Castell's 2009, identifies it as the most important dimension of the articulation of state power. If the machine functions as theorized, it should produce a superior alternative information output in terms of trustworthiness when compared to the current factual mass media systems as described by Chomsky and Fuchs, and thereby gain competitive control of trust. This is this mechanism that fulfills the design intention of mediating between the private sphere and the sphere of public authority. If one conceptualizes the theoretical model relative to the systems it is intended to supplant, then it begins to look a lot like a bomb with a lit fuse. Set to vaporize the beam dividing the symbolic representation of society from the continuous agency of their concrete reference, extending the depth of metaphor found in the semiotics of hyperlinks into the political realm, laying waste to a system of subjection where it is plausible that the silence of the masses is their great divesting strategy. This author is here in concert with Mam, 2020. Only to blow pipelines in the infoscape requires a tactical assault not just on the institutions that comprise these pipelines, but their underlying metaphors as well. Douglas, 1986. The author is committed to a form of warfare that is both and at once material and semiotic.